Well, I hit the button there, and it took about 30 seconds before it actually went live. There's a funny tense moment when you click the button and you invite the world into what was the pre-show conversation. Um, I always find when I start the streams, I go into this weird presenty sort of voice. I always want the streams to just feel like a casual conversation, but then I reflect upon my own delivery, and I'm like, oh no, it's like I'm like inviting people into a circus ring or something. So it's chill and calm. This is a nice casual Bible study on Proverbs, and two excellent guests with me today. Returning to the channel, British Brian, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. I've got
Great.
a nice cup of tea here with me. I'm ready to dive into Proverbs.
Very British. The tea. I never felt patriotic until I was on my first long haul flight, and then I had a cup of tea and suddenly everything felt like home. And I realized that I do have some affection for Blighty. And Anna, welcome to the Lambda Bible Studies. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm good. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Great. And I mean, what a delight to look at a chapter of Proverbs like we're going to do today. British Berean, I wonder if you would pray for us as we start.
I'd be delighted to. Almighty God, thank you that you have given us the book of Proverbs and had it preserved for us so that we may grow in understanding of you by reading about it. I ask that as we look at it today, we will grow in wisdom, and we will grow in prudence, and we'll grow in our love towards you. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Well, without further ado, here it is. Proverbs chapter 12. I'm not sure how we should do this. Normally I read self-contained passages, but in this case, we could probably do every single proverb and talk about it for 15 or 20 minutes, but then we'll be here for about 6 hours. So I guess what I'll do is I'll read 4 verses, and then we can kind of jump in and talk about whichever ones stand out, whichever ones we think we have something to say on. How does that sound?
Yeah, that sounds good. I think this chapter is actually split into two halves. I think the first half ends on verse 14, and then the second half ends on verse 28, obviously. But it's not like a rigid split, I think. So.
Okay, well, we're going 4 at a time. We're going to end up bridging that middle section. So you'll have to. I'll do a 4 and a 6 and a 4 or something like that. Okay, here's the first 4. Whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but he who hates reproof is stupid. A good man obtains favor from the Lord, but a man of evil devices he condemns. No one is established by wickedness, but by the root of the righteous. But the root of the righteous will never be moved. An excellent wife is the crown of her husband, but she who brings shame is like the rottenness of his bones. It actually feels like the first 3 would have been a more sensible division. What do you reckon? These feel connected to me. The practical outcomes of living righteously and being good and pleasing the Lord.
Yeah,
in 3 ways.
Yeah, it definitely seems like 4 has a slightly different like undertone to it than the first 3. The first 3 are about the way in which the righteous acts, whereas the fourth one is more about just a truthful statement about reality, I suppose.
Are these meant to be opposites, loving knowledge and being stupid, I guess? I mean, I'd think of ignorance as the opposite of knowledge.
Sorry, you go.
Yeah, some translations say brutish instead of stupid, but
either way, I guess the distinction here is somebody with great depths of understanding versus think of a somebody who's who's a bit dim.
Yeah, well,
It's a nice way to say it.
I mean, hating reproof, I guess, is they have no interest in learning. Not that they're of lower intelligence necessary. It's that they're choosing not to pursue that.
Yeah, but I guess you could see how, as a child, if you care for the things you're being told to do, that will lead through your life to becoming a knowledgeable person. I don't know if loving discipline, I don't think this is a masochistic desire, is it? It's not somebody who goes out of their way to get punished, but this is somebody who appreciates the positive effects that punishment is yielding in them as a person.
Yeah, I think the discipline as described there is relates to orderliness rather than necessarily
that was going to be my question.
some sort of like self-whipping, like the vision of the monk whipping his back with a cat o' nine tails or something. It's more that if it's disciplining from others and from yourself that you're able to live an orderly life.
But I'm thinking about the Hebrew parallelism, and I think what we see is the same idea stated and then negated. So we should expect these to kind of line up.
Right. So in the second line, it's hating reproof. That is, you'll have no harness upon yourself. That is someone who wishes to live almost like a libertine existence.
Yes.
Without the counsel of their friends or anyone really, like unwilling to submit to any kind of authority outside of themselves. They hate reproof, so they do something stupid because they're stupid, and they get told off for it, and they just hate that, and will jerk away from that and continue on in their stupidity or brutishness. So that seems to me the parallel connection there.
To move on to the next two, I wonder what do we think about this claim often in wisdom literature that good people flourish in their life. We see here a good man obtains favor from the Lord, and then the opposite is no one is established by wickedness, and the root of righteous will never be moved. Do we see this in real life? And isn't there the opposite as well? I think there's some Psalms that talk about how come there are wicked people who are flourishing. Isn't this a complete contradiction?
Well, and you just think about Job, who was a righteous man and had lots of terrible things happen to him as a result of that specifically. But when I looked at this verse initially, I was thinking more about which verse? No one's
the favor from the Lord.
Favor from the Lord.
Verses 2 and 3.
Yeah, favor from the Lord. Perhaps this means more in an eternal sense and not necessarily in a direct day-to-day, do a good thing and receive a good.
It's not like karma.
Yeah.
So then the root of the righteous, I mean, we think about the parable of Jesus about building a house on a solid rock. And we definitely interpret that in an eternal sense, don't we? That actually your root won't be moved because it isn't an earthly root at all.
Right.
Yeah. There's a real sense that verse 3 in particular is talking about the foundations of life and not simply the outward appearances.
I do think there is an earthly sense to it as well. Not that every time somebody is evil, it undoes them. Nor even that people can't occasionally become extremely wealthy through wickedness. But that there is a certain sense in being righteous. There's a pattern that those people who do well are often they're succeeding through diligence, through hard work, through attention and care. So I'm not disagreeing that there's an eternal interpretation here, but
I was told, I can't remember, a long time ago when I was studying a theology course, that and it kind of stuck with me, that when we're talking about like Proverbs and wisdom literature in general, that a proverb is a kind of general dictum about the way in which things ordinarily are. And I don't think that's all encompassing, because I think there is a sort of fundamental truth that is sort of true in all circumstances in a lot of proverbs. But then there's also these kind of ones describing, as you say, like physical and practical things, and you can't really escape the fact that they're clearly talking about practical things. But those are not always the case. I tend to think about it in terms of the laws of the laws of morals and social relations, just like we talk about the laws of physics. So we talk about gravity as a law of physics, and that so you would expect when you sort of drop a rock that it falls to the floor, but sometimes there are barriers in between the rock and the floor that will stop it. So whilst one could say this is a general law that applies, there are other circumstances that can alter the flow of and the outworking of that law. And the same is true for the wisdom literature. That is, this is a law that does apply. You know, God does bless that those who work in a righteous manner, and you don't develop a fortune by acting duplicitously with everyone that you deal with. But there are also other forces around which may shatter that fortune, which have nothing to do with your righteousness or lack thereof.
I saw Philopocrat in the chat, and so I had to come and take a look at the Hebrew. Those who've watched episode 2 will recognize here the name of the Lord, presumably with some prefix that means from, and that's as much as I've got. So let's go back to the version that we can actually understand. Great. How about this verse 4? An excellent wife is the crown of her husband, but she who brings shame is like rottenness in his bones. Do we think this description of the wife as being the crown of her husband is an evil, regressive, patriarchal perspective, or is it a celebration of womanhood and actually is uplifting? How do we feel about this?
I think it's a wonderful thing.
Maybe it's a leading question. I just think it's interesting that I immediately sense when there's a verse like this, I'm so embedded with our culture that my defenses come up immediately, and I almost can't appreciate a sentiment like this without feeling the stings of rebuke from modernity.
That's just because modernity hates women, really.
Yeah, I guess.
Because this verse is really is a really wonderful is a really wonderful compliment to an excellent wife, because it's essentially saying that an excellent wife is the glory of her husband. So the glory of something is like the cherry on top of the cake. It's the most beautiful, prominent, distinctive part. And so the Solomon or whoever originally stated this is saying that an excellent wife is like the cherry on top of the cake. She's the most glorious and vibrant part of the marital union. She's the crown of her husband.
I just can sense the low IQ take that this is merely saying that the wife is a possession who should be, considered like one of the husband's many possessions. But I don't think that's what this is saying at all. I mean, the opposite, that picking a bad wife is like rottenness in the bones. Like it's absolutely integral to who you are. Once you're married, you are almost, it's like you become one, right?
A king is not a king without his crown, right?
Yeah, and the contrast here, it is the man who has an excellent wife is a king, and the man who who's chosen poorly and his wife is bringing shame is, I mean, on the path to death. I would say you couldn't have a much more extreme contrast,
right? And I think, whereas modernity might interpret crown as a possession, she's a trophy wife or whatever. A crown is more than that, right? It's a symbol that you have authority over a given realm.
Mm-hmm. So, yes, absolutely. Great. Let's read the next. Should we do 6 and get to 10? The thoughts of the righteous are just. The counsel of the wicked are deceitful. The words of the wicked lie in wait for blood, but the mouth of the upright delivers them. The wicked are overthrown and are no more, but the house of the righteous will stand. A man is commended according to his good sense, but one of twisted mind is despised. Better to be lowly and have a servant than to play the great man and lack bread. Whoever is righteous has regard for the life of his beast, but the mercy of the wicked is cruel. Maurice, good afternoon to you. You are on time. Congratulations. We don't often stream at this time, especially at the weekend. So I guess we'll probably have a few different people around.
I propose that we return to tradition and start calling our pets beasts.
Yeah. The life of his beast. I bet it doesn't say beast in the NIV. What do you reckon?
No, it probably doesn't.
Should we go through from the top? The thoughts of the righteous are just. So even in the Old Testament, it's not actually completely novel for Jesus to reinterpret morality in terms of your thoughts, as Christopher Hitchens used to accuse. And here is a connection being made between righteousness and justice, which maybe is an obvious connection. And then the reverse then is wickedness and deceit. So interesting, the contrast there, justice versus deceit, deceitful, trying to get around the rules, which I guess shows that justice is sort of self-apparent. Maybe I'm jumping through too many hoops here, but if justice and deceit are opposed, that implies that honesty and justice go hand in hand, right? People, when they're honest, know what justice and righteousness are. And the reverse requires sneaking. Okay, next one. Unless you've got any thoughts on that. The words of the wicked lie in wait for blood, but the mouth of the upright delivers them.
5 and 6 are a development of one on the other, right? So that 5 is talking about starts with thoughts and counsels, those things which go on within the mind that are kind of the next most thing to the heart, the kind of the first bubblings of action. And then verse 6 is about the words, so the next stage along, that is the results of one's own deliberations.
The words of the wicked lie in wait for blood. Lying in wait puts me in mind of Cain, right? Who lay in wait for his brother and then killed him. But it's interesting, it's not that the wicked lie in wait for blood, but it's their words. And then the mouth of the upright delivers them. So what I actually get from this is that the the words are not lying in wait for others' blood. The words are actually lying in wait for the wicked themselves. It's like they've set a trap and they're going to fall into it themselves. That, if you say something expedient and then the next day you have to dig in on the lie, and then the day after that you're in real trouble because of the wicked words that you said a few days before.
Yeah, this is a concept that pops up multiple times throughout Proverbs, is that people that intentionally do evil end up setting a trap for themselves, and it will be their...
And then the reverse being that actually, because you were upright, you got out of a problem that you were in. Something I think is quite interesting as a concept. If you find yourself in a difficult situation, one prudent thing to do is just to tell the truth, as opposed to, or just to say good things, just to be upright. Don't be deceptive. Right.
I'm reminded of Jordan Peterson. I think he's given a few stories where he's taught. He seems to have managed to live next to some crazy people in his time. And there's one I remember him. One story in particular, I remember him talking about where his neighbor or something was a drunkard who would constantly be trying to get money off him and his wife, and he came up to like Peterson with a microwave, trying to sell it to him at 3 a.m. or something ridiculous, and Peterson said basically he realized he had to be brutally honest with this man, and he couldn't deviate from the truth whatsoever, otherwise the man might do something extraordinarily violent. I don't know how true that is, but it did strike me as something that may be true with people who are somewhat psychologically unstable and don't trust anyone. Having truthful words will at least people will recognize that when they're around you, they can trust the things that you're saying are not intentionally unreliable. That if you say you're not going to do something, then they can believe you're not going to do it. And if you say you are going to do something, they can believe you will do it.
Well, if you're trying to stick to a lie, not only do you have to coordinate the real world that has enough pitfalls and snares for you as it is, you also have to maintain the lie. So there's certain parts of action that could save you, but you now have to also avoid those so that you're not exposed for your otherwise wickedness.
Yeah, absolutely. This happens to the apostles in the New Testament also quite a lot, where they'll be arrested under false pretenses just because the people in the particular place where they're preaching the gospel are irritated at their presence, and they won't be able to charge them or convict them of anything because they've not done anything dishonest, and they've always been very open about their activities.
What about this then? A man is commended according to his good sense, but one of twisted mind is despised. Now, it strikes me that there are times in life and in history where people have been given opportunities, social points, they're seen as cool or whatever for being twisted, for breaking moral ideas and so on. So what does that break this proverb? Say a punk rocker who becomes famous and goes on tour and so on, and that only happens because they're pushing social conventions and being shocking.
I think there's definitely this meets with what I was saying earlier about them being general principles that apply in almost all circumstances. If you're in a society where those in sort of civil authority or elsewhere where they ought to be applauding those who do good are themselves evil, then they're going to commend evil people, and they're going to despise the good. This also could be talking about before God also, right? So before God, a man's commended, and before God someone of twisted mind is despised.
It reminded me of the more common English proverb, "There is no honor amongst thieves." And I wonder if there are whole communities of people who have a common interest and therefore interact a lot, spend time together, and yet they actually despise each other. I think there are quote unquote friendship groups and families who are like this, who kind of have a deep down resentment for one another because they're in this twisted path together. It's maybe something that we don't appreciate enough, that in a church there is genuine commendation and people around who actually don't despise one another. Not only that it is a community, but it is a good community. And I wonder if that's not appreciated enough. All right. Better to be lowly and have a servant than to play the great man and lack bread. What do we think? I think there's lots of people who do the second.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and the number of things I've seen on Twitter where someone's taken like a TikTok post where someone's been trying to paste themselves in a really flattering light, and they haven't noticed that in the background their bedroom is just full of like empty pizza boxes, trashed equipment, and that sort of thing. It's better to at home have a a comforting and stable environment than to give this outward appearance of grandeur, but actually to be impoverished where it really matters.
The obvious playing of the great man today, I guess, would be an influencer who rents a mansion for a weekend, records hundreds of videos, and then posts them over the next month.
Are you trying to make a confession, Lambda? Or
well, I'm broadcasting from the East Wing, of course. But how is this true? Like, why? Well, maybe a first question is, why is having a servant seen as the opposite of lacking bread? Is this an endorsement of evil slavery? And how can you have a servant and be lowly? All of these questions this proverb throws up.
Well, kind of throughout history, having people of a lower class, and I guess maybe not every culture, but having somebody else in your house to help out with whatever, the cooking or the cleaning, if you're of a certain status, like that was fairly normal. Right? Not. So perhaps it just alludes to that rather than an endorsement of slavery.
Well, I've wondered about this before because we think of our society as being so superior because of our easy lifestyle. We have Tesco's and we can get food by exchanging a small amount of money. You get this range of possible goods and services that just historically didn't exist. However, what did exist, as you say previously, was it was extremely common to have households that included servants. And I guess something that historians maybe could fill me in if I'm correct about this, but I suspect that it would have been a reasonably common life path to be a servant of some sort, to serve for a period of your life, rather than to go on being a servant into your 60s. And actually, what we have today is minimum wage jobs where you are doing servile tasks, just you're doing them sort of en masse. So what we've lost is any personal relational connection to the person who's doing menial tasks on your behalf. yet you do have people preparing your food for you, or whatever it be, driving you around, but it's Uber, and it's a different Uber driver every time.
I think, yeah, on the one hand, I guess there was indentured servitude in which you paid off a debt over a period of time with labor. And then there's also, in some cases, I would guess, like you would basically be an extended member of the family in some way. And it would be a lifelong kind of devotion to a particular, person. And
but being a servant to a high-ranking individual wouldn't be a menial position.
No, right. There's a sense of devotion that you would have to that particular individual or family. And, if it's over, especially if it's over a long period of time, it's like, them really well. It's not a degrading thing to do a job and to do it well for someone that you have affinity for.
So people make today a lot of jokes about alpha, beta male, and that sort of thing. But there is a truth in that there a lot of people will find their life perfectly satisfactory if they're serving someone who is, a wise and honourable and diligent, head of household.
Would a CTO or a CFO of a big corporation in a prior age have actually been a servant of the CEO? So if you're doing something, I'm thinking of like a pharaoh of Egypt would have had accountants, and those people would probably have been slaves, I would have thought, but they're essentially just their lifestyle and their role would be identical to what today we think of as a chief financial officer of a big corporation. Maybe. Anyway, food for thought. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, and then also this might also work both ways too, because if you're in charge of a house and you have people serving you, you're gonna have some sort of a similar feeling towards them, because if you treat them terribly, they're gonna do a bad job, or they're not gonna be motivated to work well. So it's a mutually beneficial relationship.
Yeah. But anyway,
the contrast here as well is between servant and bread. So there's an underlying implication that that the person who plays the great man and lacks bread is unable to feed themselves, whereas the lowly one who has a servant has sufficient abundance to feed two people, themselves and their servant. Because this like implication of this like modern insertion of slavery into this verse isn't really apparent in the verse itself. There's a connection there that the servant is sticking with the lowly one because the lowly one is able to feed them.
And I guess the reason it seems odd for it to be possible to be lowly and have a servant is because today you have to be pretty well off to hire help, whereas that would have been quite a middle class lifestyle, I think.
I mean, today half of your income goes towards keeping those servants in tower block slums. So
right.
It's not necessarily a better arrangement than.
Yes, exactly. Okay. Whoever is righteous and has regard for the life of his whoever is righteous has regard for the life of his beast, but the mercy of the wicked is cruel. Interesting that this is one of those rare verses that actually talks about how our attitude towards animals is important. The other one I think of is the last verse in Jonah, that finishes by pointing out that God should care for Nineveh partly because there's so many cattle there. And in this case, a righteous person cares for his pets, whereas the wicked, even the mercy of the wicked is cruel. Like, I'm going to be merciful towards you. Even that state is pretty bad.
Well, the second half of this verse has really, really been on my mind the past 2 odd years. just with all of the how the government responds to stuff in particular. There's politicians always make an appeal. Oh, this is the kind thing to do for people that have less than, and it really isn't at all. It strips them of the kind of dignity of being able to provide for themselves, and it leads to further lenience on ever more people to whom they have no connection, no obligation to. And I don't know, I just think about this one a lot with regards to the direction of our overall society.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way, that it may actually be, it might be the fact that they're being kind that is particularly bad. I feel I have to read this quote from C.S. Lewis. You probably know the one. Of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It would be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty might sometimes sleep. His cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. Somewhat chilling.
Ouch.
Reading that at this point. Actually, let's keep going, because I think it gets even more.
I was going to make one comment on this verse, which is in Matthew Henry's commentary on this particular verse. He mentions Pilate and the way in which, when Jesus was brought before him, he tried to appease the people by saying, "Oh, I'll just chastise him and then let him go." And that in that particular case, obviously, Jesus was entirely innocent of every single charge that was brought against him. And yet Pilate was was being supposedly merciful by saying, "Oh, I'll just punish him," rather than killing him. And I can think of examples like that today, where by placing some, like, their own misdeeds in a contrast between what would be right and what it would be really evil, they pretend that their wrongdoing is somehow better or good, just by putting it in a center position between two others.
I've often heard it said that the eye for an eye rule was put in as a limit, that the natural human impulse is to take retributive action in excess of what has been taken from you. So you took out one of my eyes, I'm going to take out two of your eyes. So an eye for an eye in the Bible was to limit the damage. I've also sometimes thought that life in prison may be considered a worse punishment than the worst crime, than the worst punishment in the Bible, which would have been capital punishment.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's a whole stream behind that, but yeah,
is that
absolutely
not a perfect example of this verse, that the mercy of the wicked is cruel? The mercy here being, we're not going to kill you. The cruelty being, but you're now going to be stuck for 70 years behind bars. I was going to read the end of this quote from C.S. Lewis. This very kindness stings with intolerable insult. To be, quote, cured against one's will, and cured of states which we may not regard as a disease, is to be put on the level of those who have not yet reached the age of reason, or those who never will, to be classed with infants, imbeciles, and domestic animals.
I think the cruelty extends both ways as well, because it extends to the victim as much as it does the perpetrator. So there's no under the laws of ancient Israel, there's no way you'd be put in prison for theft, for example. Instead, you'd have to repay the person who you stole from, sometimes by working as their servant. Whereas by putting them in jail, what
Actually, it
happens
doesn't help the person who was
exactly, and the
damaged.
victim doesn't get anything back from it. Whereas under the Mosaic system, if I steal from you and I'm convicted of that crime, I now have to work for you to repay that debt. And it's really cruelty to not put that punishment in, because it means the victim doesn't get anything in recompensation.
And there's a relational. I know there's a sort of idea of retributive justice, which has become fashionable in some circles, but the idea that the person who was harmed and the person who was the perpetrator should have some conversation back and forth about what's happened. That's a component of the justice system which is quite healing on both ends, and again is not at all dealt with in our modern justice system. Great. Shall we do the next few verses? Whoever works his land will have plenty of bread, but he who follows worthless pursuits lacks sense. Whoever is wicked covets the spoil of evildoers, but the root of the righteous bears fruit. An evil man is ensnared by the transgression of his lips, but the righteous escapes from trouble. From the fruit of his mouth a man is satisfied with good, and the work of a man's hands comes back to him. As a kind of, there's a symmetry there, isn't there? That we, in these four we read, starting with if you work your land, you'll have bread, and it finishes with when you work, that work will come back to you. Almost quite an economic comment there, that what you're exchanging when you work comes back to you as work for you, but perhaps in a different form. And then he who follows worthless pursuits lacks sense. There's quite a lot of things that I could think of in my life that have been worthless pursuits, like hours spent playing video games or whatever. I don't know that they're always worthless. There can be some times where you can argue the value of it. But is lacking sense sinful, do you think?
I mean, it's definitely not wise, right?
Yeah, well, I guess this is maybe a broader question for the whole of Proverbs, but are we? Is it a different category? I guess. I guess this is how a lot of people view it. I'm not sure if I agree. That there is kind of good and bad, and if you do bad things, that's sinful. And then there's wise and foolish, and if you do foolish things, it's not actually sinful. It's just dumb. I've heard people put it this way. I don't quite see that distinction. I guess because the product of doing wise things has morally important consequences. Do you know what I mean? If you,
yeah, I mean, you can distinguish
things
between these things, but there clearly isn't. I mean, even from Proverbs, it's quite obvious that being a fool is founded on a moral wrongheadedness. I can't remember the precise chapter and verse, but it's written that a fool says in his heart there is no God. So that the foundation of foolishness is hatred of God and denial of God. Now, obviously, there's the fact that as humans who are learning and who are gaining in knowledge and prudence and wisdom, we're going to make mistakes, and I don't think it's right to say all those mistakes are necessarily moral failings, because some of them are just failings of they are just genuine mistakes, failings of understanding, and that, but there's a real overlap between those two things. It doesn't seem obvious to me what the easy answer is to that question.
Well,
of
let me
yeah.
probe this then. Did Jesus do anything during his lifetime that could be described as foolish?
No.
But didn't he grow? Like, don't we read about him?
That's true. He does grow in knowledge and understanding, I think. I have to find the precise verse in Luke which describes it.
Wisdom and stature.
When he was lacking,
that's the one. Yeah, that's right.
So then when he was lacking in wisdom, does that mean that he acted in foolish ways? I like to think the viewers are also pondering this as we leave the silence. It's not an easy question. I wonder whether you have an orbit of your ability that is based on your current level of understanding and wisdom, and you are morally expected to act within that orbit correctly because you have the understanding. And then when a situation comes across your path and you know that it's beyond your orbit, there might still be principles of prudence that apply. So you might know, for example, as a child, I need to go and find my parent and ask for help in this situation. And even as a child, it could be wrong not to do so. And as you grow up, you are morally expected to grow, so you should be becoming wiser. And as an adult, when you're faced with the same situation, you may have a moral responsibility to act directly into that same situation that as a child, your moral responsibility would have been to go and find a parent. Does that make sense? So there's kind of a transition where wisdom becomes moral responsibility. Growth in wisdom is always a moral responsibility, and as you grow in wisdom, those things that you've learned become morally required of you. Is that fair? Does that seem at least plausible?
It seems plausible. I'm now. My mind's been drifting because I'm pondering how. So let's take verses 10 and 11 for example. Okay. How with wisdom, what you're trying to do sometimes is to understand which piece of wisdom is applicable in the particular circumstance. So in verse 11 we have whoever works his land will have plenty of bread. Mm-hmm. And in verse 10 we have whoever is righteous has regard for the life of his beast. Well, you have to work your creatures in order to work your land. You have to plow it. And so the sort of wise and virtuous course of action holds both of those things in tension and recognizes when it's right to work your beast hard and when it's right to lay that off, because to work it hard would be to have disregard for its well-being. And so often wisdom is how you apply these things and in what circumstances you apply them. And sometimes there isn't necessarily this is the only right way of applying these pieces of wisdom. We've
got some interesting comments in chat. So JN77 says, to sin is to miss the mark. Does the intention really matter? What do we think about that?
So I don't think sin is missing a mark.
I think that was literally the word that was used for it in Greek.
Yes, but it's a sort of specific thing that is rebellion against God. So the missing of the mark is like the result of of sin. So sin can be described as the action, or it can be described as the disposition which leads towards the action.
I mean, could we say that it's the mark is not an action, but the mark is an intention? I don't wonder if this is a false dichotomy in some ways. The dichotomy we're being presented with is that either sinning is to do with your intentions, or sinning is to do with whether you hit the mark. But I wonder if the mark is the intentions. Like if you acted to the best of your ability, to the best of your knowledge, to the best of your wisdom and understanding, and that resulted in a bad outcome, is that missing the mark? I'd argue that that's not. That's actually hitting the mark, because the mark is in your intentions. But I can't immediately think of a biblical situation that would back me up on that. So I feel like it's on the tip of my tongue, but it's not coming to mind. So I might have to come back to you on that. Marie says, I mean, you can sin accidentally and willfully. Well, that's why I just wonder, is it possible to sin accidentally? Is sin not inherently an act of the will that opposes God? I mean, I think of Pharaoh and his heart being hardened, for example. Maybe there's an element to it where eventually your actions are so automatic that they're sinful without even any intervention from your will. If you try to be upright and still fall short, it's miles better than if you willfully embrace sin. Yes, but God's standard is perfection, right? Isn't this what we learn from Romans?
Yeah, and I think there's definitely, when we talk about, well, when sin's talked about biblically, I believe it's Paul writes that whatever is not of faith is sin. So when we're talking about trying to be upright, so if we're trying to be upright, but we're not doing that because we have a trust in God, but we're doing so on our own efforts and leaning on our own understanding, I don't see how it is any better than willfully embracing sin, because we are, in fact, willfully embracing the sin of our own autonomy, our own sort of separate righteousness from God.
Yes, you're right. This is 100% the place to go to figure these things out. So this is talking about whether it's right to eat food which is unclean. And the argument is that actually now that our righteousness comes from Christ rather than from following the Old Testament laws, it doesn't actually matter whether we eat clean food or not. However, for somebody who still thinks that it's wrong, for them to eat it is wrong, right? For whatever does not proceed from faith, as in whatever you do that's outside of what you think is acceptable. Is that fair? It becomes wrong because if you have doubt, let's go back. Whoever has doubts is condemned if he eats, because the eating is not from faith. Faith and doubt there being opposed. Is that what you're kind of guessing at, BB?
Yeah, or really more just that I perhaps even go deeper than that to say that that unless the are if the foundation of any of our actions it stems from anything other than faith in God, regardless of if that action is outwardly virtuous, it's sin. So you could live a life that in word, in thought, in action was pure, but if at the heart of the matter you are not living that life on the basis of faith, then everything, the thought, the word, and the deed would be sin. Because fundamentally it's about the disposition at the heart.
Yeah. Just to make an application of this to today's situation, there's definitely people in my church, and I'm sure the churches of anybody listening, more or less, there's people there who are of the opinion that by wearing a mask, maybe this isn't true worldwide, but certainly a lot of the UK, if you don't wear a mask, you're potentially killing people. And obviously murder is against the Bible, and that's what they think. So for them, wearing their mask is proceeding from faith for them. So we, I guess, can recognize in them that action is made righteous for them. Is that fair? But equally, say for me, I kind of think the opposite. I think that wearing a mask is perpetuating foolishness. And
yeah, I think that's fair.
And so for me, the opposite is true. And so I guess it's just worth me, in my observation of the world, not to put my own standard onto other people, but to say, if they're genuinely, with their own understanding, acting in a way that accords with their understanding of righteousness, then that, if that proceeds from faith, it's good action.
Yeah, I also would want to add that it should be clear that this faith isn't this like ambiguous, unconnected concept. So when God makes it really clear in His moral law what is right and what is wrong, then if we're doing something which is openly wrong, like theft, adultery, murder, and saying that we're doing it in a righteous manner because we have no qualms of conscience about it, then firstly we're deceiving ourselves, because at the core of the matter, the evildoer who does that knows in their heart of hearts that it is wrong, even if they've sort of seared their own conscience in that way. And secondly, that that standard which God has given exists as like as an objective rule for us to examine our own actions by. But then when something falls outside the bounds of that, like you're talking about, Lambda, with the masks circumstance, there's no rule in Scripture that says you have to wear a mask, or you don't, or you must not wear a mask.
It says all those who worship with unveiled faces.
Yeah, there's that one verse in Corinthians.
I don't think that's exactly what it's saying, but perpetuating evil, I would go so far as to say. I mean, it's tough. Obviously, there's a bit of me that just wants to agree, but it's to me, the masks are a symbol, a signal, a communication primarily, rather than serving any actual medical purpose. They're a sort of display of compliance and an expression of virtue in what's going on. And I tend to think it's increasingly obvious that what's going on has more to do with the political project than actually people's health.
However, I have the same state of conscience as you around that, Lambda, and that it seems to me they're more like a talisman than than any sort of genuine stopping point.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
it says on the box that they don't protect against the
Right.
particular ailment that they're supposedly doing.
Yeah.
It'd be like buying a dream catcher, and on the box it says "Warning: does not actually catch dreams."
Exactly
it's
what it is.
really
100%.
useful for all kinds of things. Just the dream catching is not one of them. But the question, I guess, is if you were a particularly politically naive, uninformed individual around in Germany in the 30s, and you were attending church wearing your swastika, right? Is that morally culpable? I guess it looks bad in retrospect, but I can imagine people, not understanding the full context. And in the same way, I think saying that by wearing a mask you are perpetuating evil is probably a little strong. It's, maybe you've been duped, or you're inadvertently adding to an evil movement. But I think there's lots of people who are doing it from perfectly good motives. People who look around at people they respect who are doing it and just following along. But I think for me, I have the opposite. I feel quite strongly compelled that I need to push back against it. So it would almost be wrong for me to fail to make the inverse signal. So there you go. That was quite a big diversion, wasn't it? I can't remember how we got there. Oh, thank you. Good work. Any last thoughts, or should we go on to the next four?
The only thing I was going to say is the reason this is the dividing point in the chapter with verse 14 is because the other verses are all contrasts between sort of righteous and wicked and so on, whereas this is what's known as a synthetic proverb, where the second half is a sort of continuation of the first. So instead of it being a contrast between two things, it just builds on from the first half, and the same with the last verse in this chapter, actually. So that's how it's been broken up.
There's really a musical quality to some of this, isn't there? It's like if you were playing back and forth between two chords, like a jam for 16 bars, but then the last time you just hold on that one chord a couple of times.
I love as well with this how oftentimes the first time you read a biblical book, and Proverbs in particular, it seems to be quite haphazard and with very little pattern. But when you dig into it a bit deeper, you start to notice all of these really, really intricate patterns in each of the chapters, in the arrangement of the verses, and so on, which help to drive at the detail and the deeper meaning of such things.
It'd be really cool to produce a Bible where you used color and positioning of the text to highlight some of these patterns. But then arguably the patterns exist if you just read the text, especially if you read it in a more flowing way than the stop-start manner that we're doing in these Bible studies. That's one of the mistakes people make, is to always go verse by verse and never to allow the text to breathe in the kind of natural performative way that it would have done when most people took it in through history as a long orally delivered document.
Yeah, I'd really recommend that people get readers' Bibles if they don't have them, which basically remove all of the verse numbers and clean up the text, so you can read through it as you would a normal book. I find that it's a lot easier to read large portions of scripture if you have a reader's Bible, because it is just like reading a normal book rather than being stopped every sentence with a little tiny number in the corner.
But don't use it as an excuse. If you've got a perfectly good Bible and you can't afford a reader's Bible, then let's not exaggerate. I once saw an advert for a Reader's Bible that was like, "It'll change your life."
Yeah, I mean, there's always an overselling of something. You
And
read a normal Bible; it's wonderful.
right, exactly. And even I'd say, don't worry too much about translations. Like, yeah, there's plenty of interesting conversation to be had about what the best translation is, but God's truths are remarkably tough to avert. Tim points out that directions on intent can be found here. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, saying, if anyone sins unintentionally in any of the Lord's commandments about things not to be done, and does any one of them, if the appointed priest who sins, thus bringing guilt on the people, then he shall offer for the sin that he has committed a bull from the herd without blemish to the Lord for a sin offering." So there you go. I guess that's pretty clear. We need to bring a bull from the herd to the for a sin offering. Oh, hang on. This is the Old Testament, and this is no longer how we deal with sin. But
it's too late. I've already bought a bull.
You did next day delivery on Amazon.
Yeah, it's done now.
Well, maybe you could repurpose it. I guess the point being that even though it was unintentional, nonetheless, there was a requirement for sacrifice. And if Jesus' sacrifice is a stand-in for this sin, that kind of implies that even unintentional sin bears some weight of guilt. Interesting. Indy's suggesting the correct way to read the Bible is using Vim. I can't argue with that. But turn off line numbers is the only recommendation I can make there. Okay, where were we at? 15. The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice. The vexation of a fool is known at once, but the prudent ignores an insult. Whoever speaks the truth gives honest evidence, but a false witness utters deceit. There is one whose rash words are like sword thrusts, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. We've kind of got two here that fit, and then a bunch that are about speaking, right? Including, I'd say, the next one, truthful lips. So why don't we just do these two to start, 15 and 16? Sort of, how do you take on board criticism? Any thoughts about this?
I really like the word vexation, and it's very. I think it's a verse for our times, in that a lot of people become very easily agitated when even the tiniest of insults are lobbed in their direction.
Yeah. It is a strangely archaic word at this point, isn't it? Like if you were to talk about Twitter, for example, and your criticism of Twitter was that it appears to be a platform that just causes vexation. Accurate.
Strangely accurate, yeah.
But it seems kind of mild today, I would say. But it is interesting that we talk about how people act in public, especially on social media platforms, that are revealing aspects of themselves. I've kind of occasionally been on Twitter and seen something that I want to respond to, and I've taught myself at this point not to get involved, even if it's very tempting. But you definitely see some people who just can't resist, and here we see that explicitly called out as foolishness. And you think, how many people would be saved from the results of their foolishness if only they were to come to Proverbs on a regular basis and meditate upon it? And they're obviously not going to do that because they're not Christians.
One thing I really miss from the age of Trump on Twitter is, despite his many failings, he was a master at drawing out the vexation of fools. He would drive so many people insane by just tweeting something, and and the response, you could just tell, was vexating these people.
Yeah. But it's interesting that not only do we have these opposites within 15 and 16, we also kind of have an opposite of 15 against 16. Do you see what I mean? So we've got the way the fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice. That's talking about a wise person listening. Then you have the vexation of a fool is known at once, but the prudent man ignores an insult. So you have to be discerning here to know whether, so the wise man, if they receive advice, pays attention, but if they're just given an insult, ignores it and steps over. But how do you know the difference between advice and an insult? And likewise, the fool is vexed, but perhaps by something, there's a difference between a fool being vexed versus, say, Jesus in the temple turning over tables. He wasn't a fool being vexed. In that case, it was a righteous anger. In this case, the fool looks at his own actions, and even though people are criticizing, he says to himself, yes, that looks correct to me. But how do you, if you're taking advice, surely it wasn't something you already knew, so how do you recognize it as wisdom? Sorry to say all of the obvious things and then immediately lob out a difficult question. It's not really fair.
Maybe even more obvious answer is that they make it known at once that it's foolishness, right? So I don't know, it's pretty easy to see sometimes, maybe not all the time, what is the difference between wise counsel and what is just utter nonsense.
There's definitely wisdom which, once you're told it, you immediately recognize it, right? Oh, of course, that's the right thing to have done. Yes, now I've been given the wisdom. It's really clear. And then an insult is also, I would say, quite easy to discern. If it's for example, if you're being criticized for something, but the criticism is superficial, say, oh, you don't want to hang out with that person, they're ugly. The Bible talks about assessing who you want to spend time with based on their moral character. So they're an insult is kind of baseless, simple. I do think it's quite self-evident to distinguish wisdom when you hear it. Even, I think, wisdom that proceeds from non-Christian sources. Maybe this is a more controversial thing to say, but I think you can obtain wisdom even from things that are sort of fortune cookies or wise characters in movies. You have to be discerning, and not everything that appears to be wisdom is, but there's cases where people can bring you something that has genuine depth of insight. Oh, we've lost Anna again.
Yeah. Do you think the advice mentioned in verse 15 is necessarily wise advice, or do you think it's advice of any kind which the wise man is, by nature of his wisdom, is able to sift?
I guess that question comes down to whether listening implies respecting and following. That's a good question. I also remember reading a proverb that talks about how the wise are known for their few words, and then I think about
So
my
you can be
streams
sure
where
when they're speaking that it's going to be
well, true.
edifying. Yeah.
I just wonder what negative effect it's having on me that I take part in these streams where I feel the need to fill every second full of my blabbering because I can't cope with the silence. So
The curse of the host is that you can't ever get brevity.
well, I always wonder whether we've imported a false economy from things like primetime radio and
24-hour
other
news cycle.
24 yeah, all of these content platforms which prioritize entertainment, but because I've imbibed an enormous amount of that sort of content, so I kind of replicate it automatically. But my objectives are very different. I want the people I want the people listening not to be entertained, but to be taught, I guess, or at least I guess I want to provoke us to meditate together on the Word of God. So I kind of think my streams would be better if I maybe I should set up a target for myself to have more silence every stream than the last, because those moments of empty space probably are when people at least think, possibly, dialogue with God. Philipocrat says, "You allow us fools to look wise." I don't know. Maybe. But of course, the other thing is with streams with lots of people on, if I stop talking, then somebody else may jump in.
Well, there's also a sense of appropriateness of, this is a stream discussing stuff, so you've got to discuss things.
Just go live, stare into the camera for 3 hours, stop stream.
There was a guy who did that, wasn't there? Claimed to be doing healing. Like he just looked dead into the lens.
Yeah.
Hang on, let me do it.
Oh no.
I'm feeling healed already.
Yeah, and people would just watch this guy for hours.
My legs have grown back.
Silent stream next. Also, Wolfpack put out a silent album on Spotify. The idea was that they would get their fans to stream it all night while they were asleep, and Spotify, of course, would give Wolfpack some percentage of the royalties from Spotify having played it, and then they funded an entire tour based on people playing these completely silent tracks.
Like not even white noise, just completely.
I think it was dead. Yeah, absolute silence.
You kind of got to respect the grift on that one, I guess.
Yeah,
I think I remember that. Yeah.
Okay,
I just like the supplementary idea of having people play it while they're asleep in the background. This soothing silence.
Yeah, you could. If it's not soothing enough, you can load up a couple of tabs and have it playing twice.
Well, what were all the tracks named? Just like Silence 1, 2?
That's a good
3?
question. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe there was some financial implication of whether you had one track, if it went more viral and got more plays, or if they were trying to go under the radar. All these questions and more that I have no way to answer. Where were we at? We must have done 15, 16, 17, and 18. There's one whose rash words are like sword thrusts. Can you relate to that? I can, where occasionally I've said something and wanted to take it back, but the damage has already been done. But the tongue of the wise brings healing. With God's grace, occasionally I've felt that way. Maybe two of my friends are fighting with each other and you can mediate, and often to do so requires not rashness, but contemplation and patience. Should we do another 4? Truthful lips endure forever, but a lying tongue is but for a moment. Deceit is in the heart of those who devise evil, but those who plan peace have joy. No ill befalls the righteous, but the wicked are filled with trouble. Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who act faithfully are his delight. A lot of these are quite similar. I wonder if these are almost like the memes of the day. Shows how poor our culture is by comparison, right? But not that they were iterated by the people, because these were all supposed to have been written by Solomon, right? But more like people would share them, and then maybe Solomon would iterate his own formula, be like, truthful lips endure forever, but a lying tongue is for a moment. Yeah, it kind of gets my point across, but there's a slightly different angle on it. Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who act faithfully are his delight. Both cases, to boil it down and give the dry, simple application is don't lie or be truthful. But there's so much more depth here. Do you know what I mean? There's a kind of paucity to the fact that we often try to simplify down the message out of things, and we lose all the interesting connotation.
The 2 proverbs here that you've pointed out seem to be exploring different angles of the same the same wisdom or foolishness. That one has a more practical, pragmatic angle for whether truthful lips endure or lying tongues are for but a moment. There's something very material about that.
Yeah,
but then there's the more moral element in verse 22, where it's saying this is the connection between deceit and God hates this.
I think the repetition of it sort of draws out the relationship between thought, speech, and action, and how ultimately you're gonna say what you think, and then you're gonna act it out, whether it's good or bad. There's almost no escape from living consistently with your personal thoughts. So if they're wicked, it's going to be very apparent.
Oftentimes when those kind of Christian virtues that are not appreciated in contemporary society are talked about, the reason for their rejection is given as, you think something's good just because God said it is. Or I think something is good because practically it's good. And the way the Proverbs talk about this, it's making a really clear statement that those 2 things are not separable. And that when it comes to ultimate wisdom and ultimate foolishness, those 2 are intimately connected. That saying something is an abomination to God is as good a reason as saying this thing is practically a lying tongue is but for a moment, and that the two have a relationship with one another that can't be split apart as easily as that.
I guess the deep question, to which there's probably either no answer or no simple answer, the question is God's character wise because these connections between truth and prosperity were inherently baked into the mathematics of reality, and God conforms to it? Or was God's character truthful in some abstract way, and he instantiated a universe in which, according with those characteristics he has, leads to God's blessing, and that the bad consequences of evil behavior are a direct judgment from God? I guess the simple question then is, is good that which accords with God's character, or does God conform to an idea of good that is
So it's
in
definitely
existence without him?
it's definitely not the latter.
Okay.
Because that would say that there is a God above God, that there is some sort of reality which is outside of God. That's the sort of pagan Greek way of thinking about such things, but it's certainly not the Christian. In fact, the Christian solution to because what you've talked about there is similar to I think it's called the Euthyphro dilemma, of like art is good because the gods say it is, or are the gods good because they follow goodness. But the Christian response is that God is good in his being, and those two are not. You can't pull goodness out of God and treat this as some sort of distinct thing.
Philopocrates
And yeah,
says
I think I was going to say Philopocrates' comment in chat is correct.
God is his attributes, and so he is wisdom. We are wise only in as far as we participate in him. We also see God is love. I think in one of the is it 1 John, 2 John?
Yeah, God is love, God is holy, and many other attributes God has, but they're not separable. So when we in the Confessions, for example, God is talked about as being simple. That doesn't mean that he's not. That doesn't mean simple in the sense of simplistic, but it means simple as in these things are not separable from him or within him. That in fact he is his attributes. And it's complicated, but it's not complicated in that it's difficult to understand from a human perspective. But there's no logical contradiction in that and how we talk about him.
Yeah, I like the idea that we can take these abstract concepts and simply draw some ontological equality to God. I haven't looked into it enough to know if it's actually grounded or if it's just a tidy philosophical idea that is plausible. But do we know that? Do you know what I mean? Like, is this an idea that just sounds good, and the reality is God hasn't revealed the answer to the Euthyphro dilemma to us, or perhaps it's beyond human understanding? I'm always suspicious of these formulations, I guess. But they do sound good, and then maybe they are deeply correct as well. I just like when it says God is love, then there are multiple ways that you could interpret that, and it doesn't have to be that you're making some grand ontic claim. Anyway, I didn't mean to drag us down quite such.
I mean, I think the problem is that, and this is something that you get a lot from patristic sources, but and really from the Bible. But the problem is if you start to say love or goodness is something that can be distinguished as something separate from God, then you're saying that they logically precede God, and so that means that God is not the way, the truth, and the life. It means that those things are distinct from him. It means that God is not sovereign over all things because he's not sovereign over goodness, and he's not sovereign over love.
Yeah, but then these kind of maximal God philosophies. I guess.
I mean, that's not a maximal God philosophy. That's simply taking him at his word in the way he describes himself.
When you say God is ruler over all, I think it's quite plausible to say he's ruler over all of his creation rather than also over abstract concepts, which maybe are also co-necessary in eternity.
But if those things are uncreated, then they're God, right?
I don't know that properties of God that are abstract even exist. But yes, anyway, this is probably
Quite a tangent,
sufficiently
yeah.
off topic. We should come back to Proverbs. Are we in the final? I think we're on the final straight. So we're doing 22 to 28. A prudent man conceals knowledge, but the hearts of fools proclaim folly. The hand of the diligent will rule, while the slothful will be put to forced labor. Anxiety in a man's heart weighs him down, but a good word makes him glad. One who is righteous is a guide to his neighbor, but the way of the wicked leads them astray. Whoever is slothful will not roast his game, but a diligent man will get precious wealth. In the path of righteousness is life, and in its pathway there is no death. And as you pointed out, the last one is not a contrast. Let's just, before we leave off that topic, what does Philopocrat say? The question is whether characteristics exist without characters. We know the characteristics because the character produces them. I just lean towards saying that abstract concepts don't exist. If that makes me a crazy non-Platonist, then so be it. Okay, so of these verses, what jumps out at you? Are you daring me for how long of a silence?
Yeah, that was one reason I was pausing.
Were you timing that? I'm interested. I'm interested how long I managed. It felt like about 3 minutes. I suspect it was about 2 seconds.
I like how a lot of Proverbs use concrete examples. So verse 27, whoever is slothful will not roast his game. I have this image of a man who has spent all day hunting, has taken down an enormous deer, dragged it back to his home. Yeah. He can't even be bothered to put it on the fire and eat it. He's just like,
It sounds stupid, but the other day I what was it? I bought something that ought to go in the refrigerator, and I was too busy with whatever I was doing all evening to put it in the fridge. And then I went to bed and I woke up in the morning. I was like, oh no. Now I can't eat it because it must have been meat of some sort.
You forgot to roast your game, is what you're saying.
So essentially, I did the modern equivalent. The other thing it makes me think of is, do you remember The Sims? You used to give the sim the instruction to go to bed, and then they were like, "I'm too tired to walk between here and the bed. I'm just going to fall asleep where I am."
Yeah, I vaguely remember that. I didn't play that much Sims, but I think I remember that happening.
I think sloth is a concept that is under-discussed, underappreciated. I think our modern society is absolutely jam-packed full of excuses for people who are just basically slothful.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is such a obvious, intuitive, and yet somehow foreign concept that I can't. The mind boggles. People are never accused of being lazy. In my experience, there's always other medicalized terms and excuses, and it's always there. Well, it's understandable. That's just because of this and that and the other.
Yeah, I think over the last year there've been a lot more reasons that people have been able to give for their laziness than before. So we were talking about mask stuff earlier. There's people often refuse to go places or to do certain things because they consider the danger. I think there's another proverb where it talks about the slothful making excuses like saying there's a lion in the street, so I can't go outside.
Wow, yes. That's like a perfect proverb for our times. Find it. It's too good to pass up.
It is an excellent proverb.
Okay, well, while I try to find where that proverb is, in the path of righteousness is life, in its pathway there is no death. That's really interesting to me, because I always am told that the Jewish conception of an afterlife was a sort of underdeveloped. But how would you read this? That there's no death in the pathway of righteousness in a pre-Christian era? What?
Yeah, I think
a baffling idea.
That's one of those weapons that's brought out against, or as an attempt to break down the Christian faith, is to say, well, the doctrines of the Old Testament are not the sort of seed for which the New Testament is the tree. They're entirely different, and you could not possibly get the sort of things that Jesus teaches or that Paul writes as an extension of what has been revealed before. But proverbs like that, I think, make it quite clear that that's just wrong. That though they're not quite as clear as we see revealed later, the kind of foundations of that kind of understanding are intrinsic to this kind of thought. It's talked about explicitly that the righteous will see no death.
Yeah. So I love this. This is literally better than most comic stand-up comedy sets. Look at this.
Yes.
As a door turns on its hinges, so does a sluggard on his bed. The sluggard buries his hand in the dish, but it wears him out to bring it back to his mouth. The sluggard is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can answer sensibly. Amazing. such an incredible roast of a sluggard.
I like how verse 15 talks about the sluggard's hand. I don't know what the ordinary practice was in those times, but I imagine they still had some culinary implements. And there's this picture of us. He can't even go to the fork and knife drawer and pull out a piece of cutlery.
Yeah. And you just get the image of somebody with, don't they, in America they call them Cheetos, don't they? It's like Wotsers. That's what I would think of.
Cheesy puffs.
Cheesy puffs. The orange. You get the dust all over your fingers.
Yeah, that seems very accurate.
Buries his hand in the enormous glass jar of cheesy puffs.
Yeah, and like, so lazy you can't even get the food. You're like, my life is so difficult because the food is almost a meter from my mouth, and just, but as much as I like to externalize this concept and think of myself as a vigorous, active kind of person, I've definitely had days where I've woken up and had nothing I had to do that day, or like maybe one chore, and I just procrastinate on and on all day, to the point I can understand that feeling that, like, well, I guess I've been both. Maybe the contrast is the best way to put this point across. There's been cases where I've been so, like, physically active that to run a mile to go and fetch something, you just do it in a jiffy, and it's like a feeling of power from the fact that you're so full of energy. And then the opposite is, I want tasty food, but either that means cooking it, and that's going to be at least half an hour, or I'm going to have to go and put my shoes on and go down to the shops, and you feel like oppressed by reality because of your own uselessness. Do you know what I mean? That being a lazy person is a curse upon you, because most of life is contained in running your own errands. So it's like you can't look after yourself. You are under the care of the worst, like a baby with the most useless parent in the world, to be lazy as an adult.
Verse I think verse 24 talks about that, in that the hand of the diligent will rule, while the slothful will be put to forced labor. That is, if someone's diligent, they're working in superabundance, well above sort of maintaining the level. Whereas the slothful is so under the level that to even be made useful, they have to be forced.
There's also an irony here, isn't there, that your diligence leads you to a position where you no longer have to do anything, because you will have people running after you, and your attempt to evade hard work puts you in a position where you're, you end up doing the exact thing you were trying to avoid, and probably for a much longer time and in much worse conditions than had you just done the small amount of diligence was initially asked of you. We were talking in the stream yesterday about heavy heart, Philopocrit. If you're still watching, here is anxiety causing a heavy heart. So there you go. In God's grace, he's answered the question of whether a heavy heart was an anachronistic concept, and it turns out it's not. But a good word makes him glad. So there you go. A heavy heart meant the opposite of being glad. It was sadness, as it means today. So I guess we preserved this phrase from the original Hebrew. One who is righteous is a guide to his neighbor, but the way of the wicked leads them astray. Again, the contrast being, one person is so on it navigationally that other people are coming to them for instruction, and the other person is so poor navigationally that they end up at the wrong place. And in particular, the way I think about this is that if you are wicked and therefore lying, deceitful, making excuses, you're making yourself a mental map of reality, especially of the moral world and the consequences thereof, that is just wrong. So you're going to keep running aground. Like if you're in a ship, you want the accurate map that tells you where the hazards are. But so you want truth to steer you correctly. But the way of the wicked, the wicked person in trying to take shortcuts and pretend that things are different from how they are, they've caused their own shipwreck.
You spend so many lies that you start to believe your own.
Yeah, and the only way you can convincingly lie, like an actor has to be in character by pretending to be that person, as I understand it. I think there isn't. I'm not an actor, so I may be mistaken here, but my understanding is the only way to convincingly portray a character is to self-deceive. And I would think the same is true in life. The only way to play a part, to act as if something is true, which isn't, is in some ways to tell yourself the same lie that you're pushing externally.
Are you saying the Puritans were right to ban the theatre?
Well, I could be easily persuaded.
Well, I think there's something of like what you pretend to be, you will become, right?
Yes. And also, and this isn't what this is saying, but I think what you pretend your enemies are, they will become as well. Do you know what I mean? If you
Can you elaborate on that?
So yes. How did I have this original idea? Probably because Well, I just notice a pattern, for example, that the media, right, often left wing, often talking about right wing groups, often says things that are just completely ridiculous at the time, and then seem spookily to. It's like people appear that a few years later that actually fits the mischaracterization that the media had. And then I thought I can almost see how this mechanism would work, because at this point, when I see something in the news, I just invert it in my head and assume that the opposite of what I'm being told is true. So, for example, on the topic of racism, I was told for my views on various issues that therefore I must be a racist. Like, take Brexit, for example. I was in favor of leaving the European Union, and I was told over and over again that I must be racist, to the point where you get told this on enough issues that you start to think, well, every time some issue is associated as being racist, it turns out to be the correct side of that issue.
Yeah.
And then you start to have cogs going, which is like, well, then therefore is racism actually am I actually racist? Even though none of those issues had any connection with racism at all. But you can see how if you didn't have a higher moral authority like the Bible to go to, you would eventually just in your brain go like, well, I guess racism equals good because it's associated with all these other things I approve of. I hope I've articulated that right, because that was a little bit subtle.
Well, yeah, I have noticed a tendency of some of the, I don't, if the alt-right they actually exist, right? Like that's a line of thought, it's like, well, they keep labeling me as this, so I'm just going to lean into it. There definitely are people that don't have a broader moral compass that fall into that. But yeah, I think another factor is that, like you mentioned with the media, is that they say, oh, X is racist, and then that becomes all they can see because that's what they're oriented towards.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that it necessarily creates. I don't know. It's hard to say. Does it create something?
Well, so for example, I think about the Nazis as they were one group, a historically, if you were to scale their significance on a bunch of axes, they wouldn't be top for almost anything, but they are the strange obsession of our culture. And you find there are groups of people who describe themselves as neo-Nazis. That's just weird. Like, you don't find equivalent groups of like people who love Pol Pot or Che Guevara or Chairman Mao in the West. Like these groups don't really exist in the same way that neo-Nazis do. And I just think the whole spawning of neo-fascism is because I know we've drifted way off the topic of this stream now, but
it's because it's been put out as like a marker, and people are drawn to that because it's sort of been reified by the fact that it's been named.
Exactly.
Yeah, I understand that. Racism is a strange one as well, because a lot of these terms, from a Christian perspective, there's no such thing as racism, biblically speaking, because the word is not found in Scripture. So you have to figure out, okay, what are the concepts that are contained within that word, which as Christians we would reject, and what are those concepts that are now contained within that word that actually as Christians we don't reject. So as Christians we can say the concepts contained within that word which we reject are things like racial malice, that sort of hatred of another person simply on the basis of their ethnicity, and racial vainglory, which is pride in oneself simply because of one's ethnicity. And those two things are kind of rejected biblically and can be like substantiated in the biblical notion of what is good. But then there are these other things that are lumped into the term, as you said, with respect to, hey, I think we should leave the EU. Oh, you're a racist. Well, there's nothing in the Bible that says, gosh, if you want your sovereign government to not be connected to to Brussels, well, you're doing wrong before God. Like, there's nothing in the Bible that says that. Nor really do I think could it be argued very well from the text.
Everyone in chat is now being like, "Oh, there's loads of Maoists, there's loads of Bolsheviks."
They're not. I understand. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but what I understood you as saying, Lando, was that there aren't specifically organized groups that fly under that flag.
Yeah,
you're doing it with socialists and so on, who will hold to Mao's beliefs largely, but they don't call themselves neo-Maoists.
No, I would say that the Ash Sarkar "I'm a communist" is an example of reification in the opposite direction, because the neocons were obsessed with rooting out what they termed as communism. So if you're on the left, the thing that you can say that's the most shocking, that you feel actually must be your identity because you're opposed to these people and they say they're opposed to this group, so therefore you must be in this group, would be the communists. So you kind of, but I agree. Okay, obviously in China, loads of people are Maoist, and there's kind of actual supporters of it outside. But I don't know. This is kind of straying off into speculative. I think, BB, your points were much better grounded than mine. So I think, for what it's worth, I think the Bible says that our identity should be in Christ, and therefore to find your identity in your race or in your political party or in any of these things is wrong. That's not to say you can't find some, you can't act in the world according to, if you're, I don't know. I'm thinking I might be drifting too far beyond the limits of this stream at this point, and maybe
Well, there's no. I mean, in biblically speaking, there's no injunction to abandon those aspects of one's culture, which are, which comport with a Christian life. We don't see in the letters in the New Testament Paul writing to the various churches saying, "Oh, by the way, you're going to have to abandon, this particular type of clothing that you wear, because I know you Galatians do that, but actually that's not cool." The things he tells the churches to abandon are those things which are directly against God's law. So like sexual malpractice being the most prominent, but there are all manner of other ones.
Well, we even have statements that every tribe, tongue, and nation will
right.
Wow, so that's I don't know, sort of a non-issue. And
right, the Christian notion of unity preserves a sort of genuine diversity, that is, people among their own nations all worshipping Christ, and not in this kind of uniform, entirely homogenous manner.
Yeah. Like it also says there is no male or female in Christ, but it's obviously not saying, all right, well, everybody's going to be able to become pregnant. It's a ridiculous, incorrect hermeneutics to get to that.
Yeah.
And therefore you can apply the same thing. Clearly, one of the things we will celebrate, in the day of the Lord, is that there are people there from all nations, tribes, and tongues, and we're not going to recognize that to be the case unless there's some way to distinguish them. But the point is that they are all subsumed in worship to God, which is a much greater and more glorious activity than than any other. Is that? I feel that this proverb, when words are many, transgression is not lacking.
You'll be able to count all of our transgressions in this stream.
Restrains his lips is prudent. I feel I wish I'd have had a bit more restraint on my lips and like not having got off into politics in the stream, which is a general thing I'm trying to restrain myself from doing on this channel. I think we need a mission as a channel, as we are as Lambda Bible Studies, and we ought to stay, what is it? One thing I do, forgetting what is behind, but straining for what is ahead. I press on, so that one day we'll reach the prize to which we are called heavenward in Christ Jesus. I may have misquoted that, but I think a lot of this politics stuff, which I understand the community has a shared view on, it's important in its place, but I am, apart from anything else, for the benefit of the YouTube censors, trying to dial it back. Does that seem like a wise take on this? I simultaneously want to provide a place for people of a serious biblical mind to explore current issues, and also want to have a place that can discuss the perennial biblical truths without being deleted from Silicon Valley's rather trigger happy servers.
Well, truthful lips endure forever, regardless of whether or not YouTube deletes the video.
Yeah, well, that is interesting. I always want to go back to the top of the stream and just explore everything in in the context of that, but I'll leave that as another exercise for the viewers. Philopocrat says, focus on the tree and not focus on the fruit. I'm not 100% sure what you're getting at. Focus on the tree and not on the fruit. The immediate thing it brings to mind is that as Christians, we produce fruit in terms of our works. But I wonder if he was referring to the roots that don't get moved that was in the passage or something else. Anyway, we're almost at 2 hours, so I'll probably end it there. Thank you very much, both of my guests. That was wonderful.
Thank you very much for having us.
Would either of you... Oh, hang on. Here's from Philopocrat. Political action is a result of spiritual convictions. Right. So the focus of the channel should therefore be on the spiritual convictions, and we can let people fill in the between the lines of how. I think it's important from time to time to talk about application. We don't want to just let everybody kind of go off and do the working on their own. We can help each other by thinking through topics in a straightforward way, but I think it would be unwise for us to end up getting the whole channel deleted when we could have some of these specific conversations on Discord. Maybe that's a practical comment to make here. And this channel, I think, would be doing good even if we had to somewhat censor ourselves. As much as I, in my young macho way, want to go down in a blaze of glory, I don't actually think that's most honoring of Christ at this moment. Great. Do either of you have anything you'd like to plug?
Nothing in particular from me, other than that I'm on Twitter and can be found arguing with Catholics from time to time.
Anna?
This is the extent of my online presence, so no, nothing to show.
Great. Well, I'll tell you what, why not join the Discord? If you want to carry on this conversation or suggest future streams or have support in these interesting times in which we find ourselves, the link should be in the description. Once again, thanks so much to my guests, and I'll catch you for, I think we're hoping to do Proverbs 11 on Thursday. So if you enjoyed this stream, then I'll see you later in the week. Okay, bye everybody.